Good morning, everyone. How you all doing? It's good to be with you all. It has been a while. I missed you all, and we've been in this series in the book of Romans. And I think Romans, for many of us, is a really, really deep book. For many of us, if we read Romans, it can be at the heartbeat and the basis of what scholars have called systematic theology, which is just a big word to say there's a lot here. And what's tough about Romans is sometimes you can read it and you can really spend like the first 8, 9, 10, 11 chapters and just be overwhelmed. Overwhelmed with the depth, overwhelmed with the power, overwhelmed with the theological richness. And I'll never forget, one of the greatest living theologians and scholars actually lives in Chicago, Dr. Scott McKnight. And Dr. Scott McKnight actually wrote a book, and it was entitled Reading Romans Backwards. And what I really, really appreciated about this was that he actually starts in Romans chapter 16, and he begins to read this letter to this church in Rome, and he reads it backwards. And what I want you to understand is that he frames this whole concept of the book of Romans as a lived theology between the weak and the strong. A lived theology, a group of people who are trying to actually live this cruciform life you've heard me talk about, a life shaped by the death, the burial, the resurrection of Christ. Or another way to say it, Christoformity, to be formed and shaped in the way of Christ. And this is what McKnight begins to unpack, and I think it's brilliant. And he starts it, and you have to understand this. You know who the person who actually brings this letter to the churches, to the house churches in Rome? Her name is Phoebe. She's considered a deacon. And this woman, Phoebe, becomes this one who goes, and they believe that there's like at the minimum 5 house churches, probably around 8. The book of Romans names 26 people, just right off the top. Boom, 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 boom. These are leaders in the church. And Phoebe goes to each one of these life groups or house churches and begins to read the entire letter of Romans. But here's the problem. In the city of Rome, you had 2 groups of people. Mason, can I borrow you for a second? Awesome. Luis, can I borrow you for a second? Awesome, right here, okay? Awesome. Hey, look at you, Birkenstocks and Nike Blazers. Okay, all right, here we go. Now, what we have here is 2 groups of people, okay? And in Rome, the 2 groups of people were considered the weak and the strong, okay? So this was not about strength, it wasn't about might, but what was happening was each group of people referred to the other as the weak. Now, you had the Jewish audience, and the Jewish audience had left Rome because of 49. There had been this whole, what Josephus records as the Christus affair, and they ended up having to leave. They returned back, and Nero, who was brought to power 3 years before the book of Romans is written, Nero, at the age of 16, becomes in charge of all of Rome. So now he's 19, Paul writes this letter, and what Nero does is he actually invites the Jewish audience to come back and actually work to help build up his empire. So they are lower class citizens in the realm of Rome. But these weaker brothers, these weaker brothers, as Paul will reference, might be weak in status, but these men and women, they're Torah observers. They don't eat pork. They practice Sabbath. Yeah. They've been circumcised. Sorry, I just had to do that. This was part of, when you started nodding, I was like, this is going to get really good. But then they would project onto the Gentile audience like, hey, what are you doing? Why are you eating that? Why are you celebrating that? Why are you partaking in that? Now, because they didn't have much, they lived predominantly in apartments. Okay, no shade on anyone who's lived in apartments. I lived in an apartment for many, many years. But this is this group of people who lived in apartments, so they couldn't and they struggled to have a lot of people over at their house, which meant that this group of people would head over to the Gentile crew. And the Gentile crew, Paul resonates with, and he refers to them in ways of being the strong. And the strong, in many ways, were like, yeah, we like pork. We're good with that. Like, we don't need to observe the Torah, Sabbath. Okay, whatever, maybe. Like, for us, like, it's about Christ and Christ alone. And in that, we can celebrate and we can have so much opportunity for connection. And what was happening, though, is these groups will come over, and in some ways, they were like, we are the elect by God. I mean, the first whole Testament, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, was written to us, and yet we don't have the rights in Rome that Luis's crew has, but Luis wasn't the elected people of God. He's a Gentile. He's a goy. And so now all of a sudden, they're coming over to this house because they are higher citizens and they're seated in their homes, and this guy's serving food that's making this person really frustrated. And this person's got customs that's making this person really, really frustrated. And if this person goes over here, he's feeling really, really judged. And when you start to see Romans 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, when you start to read that, it is a lived theology about, can these two groups of people actually get along in Christ? Welcome to America. That's probably the best way to say it. Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Luis. And I say this because if you're going to understand Romans 12, and Romans 13 and 14. Chapter 14 is all about the weak and strong. Chapter 15 is about eating actually together. Chapter 16 is all of these final words to these life groups and house churches throughout the city of Rome. And really what I want to do is I want to spend some time looking at one verse, because I think it's going to be helpful for us if we are going to break through this malaise of a divide between the weak and the strong, and there actually be people who are so committed to going deeper and deeper in the way of Jesus Christ. Forest City Church exists to do life together in Christ, with each other, for the common good. And the way that our values are driven are all based around these directions. And you know it. We go backwards. We want to know the text. That's what we're going to do today. We go forwards. We do life together. None of this was meant to be done on our own. We go upwards. We pursue God's presence. God is everywhere, like Andy was sharing this morning. We go inwards. We have to do our work. None of us have arrived. And we go outwards. And we actually use whatever gifts, talents, treasure, time, whatever has been entrusted to us, we use that for the common good of the other. And this is at the heart of who we are. And so when Paul writes these words in Romans chapter 12, I want you to see them. They're going to be up on the screen. If you want to read in your Bible, you can. But it says this: therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercies, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing God. This is your true and proper worship. Stay here for 1 second. What you want you to see there is this. Paul's writing to brothers and sisters. He's writing to the weak. He's writing to the strong. And in a whole kind of custom and culture where you had the temple where you would bring animals to sacrifice, or you would have pagan temples and you would bring animals to sacrifice, what you have is Paul saying, you now have a choice right here, right now, to offer your body just as Christ offered his body to be a sacrifice. This is lived, embodied theology. And this is your act of worship. This is a way that you bring honor, to God. This is how Paul is shaping this. Can this guy go hang with this guy? Can this guy go hang with this guy? And actually put aside the differences and actually live as Christ lived here. Continues on. And it says this, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't conform to the pattern of this world. It's okay to divide. Those people on that political spectrum. This group of people on that political spectrum. Those people who have this belief around whatever topic or issue you want to say. And don't be conformed to the pattern of this world that okays you to cancel people. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will. Continues on, Romans chapter 12, verse 3. For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. So, what is he saying? Don't think that you have all the answers. Yeah, but I'm Jewish, like I have the Torah, like I'm one of the elect. Don't think of yourself higher than you thought. No, we're Gentiles. Paul has our back. Paul is for us. Don't think of yourself higher than you ought. Because what is this all about? It's a lived theology where we are learning to break ourselves open and pour ourselves out to be a living sacrifice for the other. And then Paul writes these words, if you jump down to verse 9. And if any of you think I have this memorized, I don't. I have 2 big cheat sheets in the back called TVs, okay? So it says this. Verse 9, love. So how are we going to do this? And this is what we've been walking through. How are we going to be the kind of people who actually do this? Well, love must be sincere. We have to hate what is evil, hate what divides. We have to cling to what is good. We have to be devoted to one another in love. We have to honor one another above ourselves. So you can imagine, this is what Paul is writing to a house church going, hey, can you honor that person above yourself? Can you be so devoted to that person? Can you hate what is evil? Can you actually have a love that is so sincere? Can you cling to what is good? Continues on and says this, never be lacking in zeal, which the Jewish people would have loved it because they love the idea of being zealous for the Lord. Never be lacking in zeal. There's no shade about being zealous, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord, not just about being right. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. And continues on and says this, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. That's what we talked about 2 weeks ago. And then here's our verse for today. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't think you know it all. It's just like Paul just getting really, really plain. He's like, hey, here's the whole goal, is I want you to live in harmony with one another. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people or people who you think are lower than you. And don't think you know it all. So here's the question, going to flip the classroom. I'd love to hear from not each of you. I'd like to hear from some of you. Here's the question. What does it mean to live in harmony with one another? And when you think about this cultural context, and if you could put this on in our world today, and some of the translations will talk about, hey, having the same mind or the mindset. But when you think about this, what does it mean? And maybe you think about it from the marketplace. Maybe you think about your neighborhood. Maybe you think about it, a family member or an in-law or someone that you just struggle with. They just feel like they're on the other side of everything that the world has told you. And that it's like you're trying to not be conformed to the patterns of this world. You're trying to have your mind renewed. But like, what does it look like to live in harmony with the other? Show of hands. Oh, Gene DeFalco. Listening without judging. That's fantastic. That's great. That's amazing. That's actually what Paul says in Romans 15. He says to the Jewish people, he's like, listen without judgment. to the Jewish people? Bob?
Reach out to them at a grocery store or Panera and talk about religion and church.
Okay, so reach out or reach across. If you see them at Panera or the grocery store, the fruit aisle, and just walk up to them and invite them to church. Yeah, there you go. Okay, what else? This section or the top? Okay, right back there. Engaging with your neighbors instead of avoiding them. Yes. Yeah, and it's so easy to avoid them. So that's why we have like garages, right? We just can open our garage, pull in, close the garage, and be like, don't have to talk to you, So, right back there. Who are you? San Luis Obispo. Including one another. Yes. Including one another. I think that's so good. And here's the problem is I think sometimes it's like we don't know how to include the other because sometimes I think we're afraid, well, if I actually include that person who has a different belief or different orientation or different thought process or different background than me, then you know what? Oh my goodness, what will other people think? And this is what was actually pushing the Jewish people from going, I don't really want to go over to their house. And this group of people going, I don't really want to go over to their apartment. And I really want to go and engage with them. And it was almost giving them all of the power and the privilege to stay in their required camps instead of actually embodying the cruciform life. What about this side? Oh, right here. Yes, seek to understand someone else's perspective. That is money. The way my friend says it is to visit their position. Doesn't mean I have to buy real estate there. Doesn't mean I have to rent from there. But can I visit their position and go help me understand? You had one as well. Yes. So I just want to make sure I heard that right. We have more in common than we have in differences? Not focusing on our differences, but actually focusing on what we have in common. That is so amazing because I think it's so easy for us to look and go, okay, what are they known for? What have they done? What do they believe? Who do they vote for? Where do they live? Where do they send their kids to school? We have this in our subconscious. It's just this list. Instead of going, well, you were created in the image of God. I was created in the image of God. You have characteristics. You bleed red, I bleed red. You grew up, I grew up. You like to laugh, I like to laugh. You've probably experienced grief, I've experienced grief. There's all of these places where you can experience connection, but man, in this day and age, just like it was in Rome, it's so easy to look at the difference, and then the difference gives us reason to separate. Anyone from the balcony? Stay off of social media. That'll preach. That's so true. Because again, and that's so amazing is even in social media, the way that that's been created is there's algorithms that once you open one post, it trips all of Twitter or trips Facebook or YouTube, and it just begins trying to move you to one camp or the other. It's fascinating. So I love how Gifford says it. Next slide. Gifford says this. He says, let each so enter into the feelings and desires of the others as to be one mind with him or her. Have you ever been able to just sit with someone? And maybe it's the first time you're at a table and you're having a meal with them, and all of a sudden you get to hear their desires. It's like when you sit with someone and you find out, oh, wow, you're a dentist. What made you want to work on people's teeth? Every single day you open up an office to tell people to open up their mouth and to talk about plaque and cavity, and nobody wants to ever see you. How do you do that? And when you get to hear their desire, when they talk about the power of a smile and that the way that when they can change someone's smile. And all of a sudden it's the first thing that we notice isn't eyes, we notice a smile. And when someone can have a smile, it gives them a sense of confidence. And when someone can correct someone's teeth so that they feel more confident in their smile, it just gives them so much meaning in life. My favorite TV show this week comes season 3. You're probably going to email me about it. I won't tell you the title of it, but I will tell you in season 2, cousin Richie, he ends up having this redemptive story, and he's looking for purpose, and he's looking for meaning, and he ends up going to the greatest Chicago restaurant. And the first year it came out, it was like #1 restaurant in the world. And he can't discover purpose until he ends up being in this restaurant, and he watches this moment, and he watches the detail of washing forks and cleaning forks with no smudge, and he finds himself so captured and motivated, and he looks at this guy and goes, "You probably love food," and he's like, "No, I don't." The guy that he's like being mentored under goes, "It's fascinating that both hospitals and restaurants use the same word, hospitality. What I love is serving people. And this gives me the best chance to serve people." And then all of a sudden, you can start to see something shift. What I'm saying here is it was just one simple question that opened someone up. Are you able to do that? And what's so beautiful is when you actually are able to do that, this is where you embody what it talks about in Philippians chapter 2, is having the same mindset as Christ. And this is the whole goal. Is that in every conversation, what would Christ do? The same mind as Christ. How would Christ see? And that's the power of community. That's the power of doing life together. That's the power, as Rex was talking to our volunteer team this morning about dissonance, that's the power of leaning into the tension, but staying focused and letting Christ have your full attention. And when you can lean into that and go, yeah, I know you believe this, or you think this, or you're this, but you were created in the image of God. And what is more important to me is having the same mind as Christ. What is more important to me is seeing as Christ sees. What is more important to me is doing what Christ would have done. You go to the next line in that verse, live in harmony with one another, and it says this: don't try to act important, but enjoy the company of ordinary people. Don't try to act like you're bigger than you are. Because the truth is, you need Jesus just like I need Jesus. Just like they need Jesus. What's amazing, my friend Steve Cuss, he's Aussie and just brilliant. He wrote a great book called Managing Leadership Anxiety. But Steve and I were talking recently, and he was talking about, we live in this moment where the whole goal is to be fully human, as an apprentice of Jesus. But something happens where we struggle to actually live in harmony with one another because something gets activated. You can call it, we get triggered, whatever you want to call it. But something gets activated in us, and we will tend to go to these two places. We will either, in the midst of when we get activated or dysregulated or triggered, we will find ourselves becoming self-righteous, where we will see ourselves as like bigger and smarter and wiser and like more like in line and holy than the other, or we will get into self-preservation mode, where we won't open ourselves up. We'll almost try to pretend like the dissonance or the difference isn't even there, and we'll just give ourselves reason to actually not have to engage. And truth be told, we all have this. We all probably fluctuate. There are some conversations where we feel maybe we're like weaker in the room, maybe we're more ordinary people in the room, but somehow something triggers us and we get more self-righteous. Where I find myself getting the most self-righteous is when I see somebody else try to put down somebody else, then all of a sudden I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to take you down. Which is not actually healthy in any way, shape, or form. But I feel like my self-righteousness comes out, and I'm like, I'm going to make you feel like you don't know a thing. Which, when I do that, Christ is nowhere to be found in that. But for some of us, there are certain topics that come up, or certain people, or certain places in our country. And all of a sudden, it's like we don't want to open ourselves up. We don't actually want to share with the feelings. We don't want that person to get to see us or know us because we're afraid. What might they think, or what might they say, or what might they do, or how might they behave around us? And what's really, really wild about all of this is for the Jewish audience, they thought they were the strong ones, and Paul thought they were the weak ones. And for the Gentile audience, they thought like they were the strong ones, but in a lot of ways, they were the weak ones. And so it's not just like, oh, they're weak and they're strong. What's incredible is depending on the topic, they could fluctuate. The truth be told is every one of us, we kind of just fluctuate between weak and strong, weak and strong, weak and strong. And what Paul is trying to get at is, man, if you keep living like this, you're going to miss the whole plot. And the whole plot is a lived theology to become more like Christ. Don't think about yourself higher than you should. Engage with people who are different, because when you do, you are going to experience more of Christ. Don't be self-righteous. Don't be self-preservation oriented. And then the last verse says this, and don't think you know it all. Just love that. Hey, you're going to live in harmony. Live in harmony with one another. And everyone's like, yeah, that sounds great. Okay. Hey, don't think too highly of yourself. Interact with ordinary people. They're like, oh, yeah. And don't think you know it all. It's like Paul just letting us know. 2 moments over the last couple of weeks where this verse has just kind of hit me. So on Wednesday nights, we do this thing midweek. And it's been awesome. And like Nicole was talking about, we kind of like write a sermon together. It's been really, really fun. And we start with this thing called the Chicago Prayer. I'm not going to make you do it. And we don't have any volunteers, and we sing a cappella. Don't worry. It's terrible. I lead it out. It's great. But anyways, here's some of the values, though, is that we start by coming to the text. The C is curious, and the H is humility or humble. I say this because that's where, when you start with that, the hope is when someone shares a different perspective, that you could actually get more curious and not be like, that's wrong. That's not right. And it's been amazing. It's been incredible until this past Wednesday when I broke my own rule and I was wrong. And I totally got outed in front of the whole group, and it was awesome. It was awesome. So here's the context. Liz Janik is our children's pastor. We're reading, and she goes, oh, this reminds me of this passage from Colossians. And I think to myself, she means Ephesians. And I was like, oh, you mean Ephesians? And she looks at me and she goes, no, Colossians. And I was like, well, in Ephesians chapter 3, it says da-da-da. And then Liz goes, and in Colossians chapter 4, it says, and I remember going, oh my goodness. And then she read this whole section that I had totally forgotten. And she was right. She was totally right. And that whole conversation could have been massively transformed and changed if I didn't say, you mean Ephesians? And I said, where in Colossians? I would not have looked like a tool, and I would have gotten to learn. But it's so easy in those moments to be like, oh, I know. It doesn't mean that passage wasn't in Ephesians. It was, but that's not the point. The point was, it was also in Colossians, and the Colossians one was uniquely tied to what we were studying on that day, and I missed it. Second story. I had a friend. And she's a part of this community, and I think the world of her. And this friend has been noticing something about me. She's probably a few years older than I am. She asked me if we could go to Starbucks. And so I'm like, sure, for sure. So we sit down at Starbucks, and she begins to kind of observe something that she has been noticing about me. And in this moment, I'm sitting here going, oh, wow. This is interesting. And I start having this moment where I have these like fears where all of a sudden this woman's going to just start to attack me, or she's going to just shame me. She doesn't get self-righteous, and she doesn't get self-preservation oriented. This is what she does. I haven't been able to understand, and it's made me think certain stories that I just wanted to ask you about. I was like, number one, that's the healthiest anyone's ever talked to me. Thank you. 2, I start to share, and then she goes, so why do you have so much on your plate? Why are you doing so much? You've made these commitments and you're not being able to keep them. What's that about? And why couldn't you tell that to me? And I was like, dang it. I want to be mad, but I'm not. I'm so impressed with how she's doing this that I'm because I thought I could do it all. And she's like, you can't. And I could have started crying. Literally in that moment, I was like, oh my, because it felt so safe. And what she was doing was not being self-righteous, not being self-preservation oriented, but doing the work to want to live in harmony and actually showing up and sharing. Can you imagine if we were that kind of community? It would smell like Christ. It would look like the cross. It'd be empowered by the Spirit. It'd be something where people would just find themselves sitting at the table and going, I feel seen, I feel known, I feel loved, I feel like people actually care about what I desire and want to know what I feel and think, even if they don't fully agree. And that to me is everything. That to me is the lived theology that Romans invites us into. And so any of you who are doing life groups, well done. Walking into a different home, sitting with different people, having to fight through the self-righteousness or the self-preservation, but working to see and recognize what Christ is doing. When you do that, God is at work, not just in you, but through you and through this community. Amen? Amen. Hey, I want you to know just a couple things. Like Nicole said, downstairs, the Connect Point is a place where we'd love to connect with you. This Wednesday night is this worship and prayer night, and Andy and the team lead out on it at 1 Douglas, a couple blocks down at 7 p.m. Show up for that. The next day, the 4 City Worship album drops. It's awesome. You can find and follow that. But would you stand, and I'd love just to pray a benediction, a blessing over you. And if you wouldn't mind, would you put your hands out? It's just a way to say, here's to receive from God. My brothers and sisters of Forest City Church, may this week you walk towards the tension and the dissonance, because the Lord has your attention. May you work to have the same mind as Christ, choosing to fight against being self-righteous or self-preservation oriented, but to break yourself open, to pour yourself out on behalf of the other, because that's what Jesus did. Have a great, great week. Grace and peace. We'll see you next Sunday.